Previously on the Sugar Baby Confessionals.
Polyamory, it's having romantic relationships with more than one person at a time. I'm not really into being a sugar baby anymore. I have fallen in love with him.
How does favorite person feel about this?
Favorite person asked me if we could take a break from the whole thing, and I said that I couldn't do that. He's also in pain. It's made me question everything about my life. He wants us to be together, and if that means that we have to figure out a way to accommodate this side of me, then he was willing to work on it.
This time on the Sugar Baby Confessionals, you may have noticed your host has a somewhat different voice and a lateral lisp. Don't worry, I'm not drunk, nor am I on the verge of a stroke. If you did notice the new voice, well spotted. You too are probably neither drunk nor on the verge of a stroke. My name is Kath. I'm a woman and a feminist, and I've been parachuted in to offer a slightly different perspective. And now, to paraphrase Frances McDormand, I've got some shit to say. For the record, I don't oppose sex work. I wouldn't do it myself. Accepting payment for intimacy feels too much like surrendering my power, which is enormously precious to me. But I do support every woman's right to choose to do whatever she wants with her body. But the key word here is choose. Get used to it. It's a word you're going to hear from me a lot. As the feminist and columnist Julie Bindel points out, of course there are women and men who choose to enter the sex trade and are happy to remain in it. But laws and policy are not based on the experiences of a minority, end quote. Because the majority of people, female and male, who work in the sex industry do so because they feel they have no other choice. For every pretty woman or Holly Golightly visibly promoting the stereotype of the happy hooker, there are untold numbers of vulnerable people being exploited by pimps and johns alike. I also have no issue with Ruby's and her favourite person's polyamorous lifestyle. When it's a mutually agreed upon, empowered choice by both parties, polyamory can be a satisfying and joyous state of affairs. No pun intended. Come on, guys, I'm not ST. Puns aren't my bag. With all that said, what I do take issue with is the cuckoldry of wives that's been touched upon, but not commented upon, in the early episodes of this podcast. You see, feminism has its roots firmly planted in the sanctity of autonomy, which values choice and consent without exception. Ruby's polyamorous arrangement with FP and whatever the fuck you call it Madeleine's going on with the Marquis are based on the respective partners' mutual understanding of their needs, desires, and boundaries, and choices. From what I can gather, the wives of the married men who date Ruby and Madeleine largely have no idea they're being cheated on. Had they given their informed consent for their husbands to engage the services of a sugar baby, I'd have no problem with it. But from what I can gather, most of them haven't. Ruby's only regret is for the wife of Frenchie, who's recently given birth. She values Mrs. Frenchie not for her status as a fellow woman, but for her status as a mother. We have a word for that kind of attitude, and it's patriarchal. So I'm sorry, ladies. However much you value your own vulvas, what you're selling here simply ain't feminism. But now let's hear from ST and the Sugar Babies, which, let's face it, really needs to be someone's cool band name.
In a world where married middle-aged women become sugar babies.
We are not middle-aged. Let me just put that right out there. If we take nothing else away from this.
I have to tell you, that's been plaguing me lately.
I fully intend to live to be 100, so I'm going to claim that.
I'm right there with, you know what?
Yeah.
I say we rename this as the club of women who are going to live to be at least 100.
And then
The centurions or centurions?
I love it.
Awesome.
Exactly.
And you know that we're going to do another podcast when we are 100, and
Yeah.
we're going to recap our lives.
That'll be the final recap.
It'll probably be easier. We'll all be implanted with computers by then, so that'll work out real well.
Yeah, we won't even have to talk to each other because we'll all be floating in, I don't know, gel or something. I don't know what they'll do. Madeleine and Ruby, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm doing really well. This is Ruby. Nice to talk to you ladies.
Good morning. This is Madeline.
We're talking about feminism. We're talking about sex work with regards to feminism, the different perspectives that people have on it. It's definitely not a cut and dried issue. It's been highly contentious amongst feminists, never mind society as a whole. But before we get started with that, I'd really like to know what each of you actually thinks of feminism. What is your idea feminism?
My idea of feminism is empowering women to be in control of themselves and their bodies and have the same rights and authorities that men have.
That's what I think. I think what most people would say. Ruby, what do you think? What does it mean to you?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Madeleine just said. The way I would phrase what feminism means to me is a person is a feminist, whether you're a man or a woman, you can be a feminist. And essentially, you are for the equal valuing of men and women. So when I say equal valuing, what I mean is to say that women should definitely be paid the same amount for the same kind of work and given the same opportunities that men are given, and just to be valued in society, to have the same type of agency over your life, to have the same kind of power over the decisions over your own body, things like that. I think that there are many situations in which we wouldn't think twice about looking at it and saying, oh, that man was given the short end of the stick. But if a woman were put into that kind of situation, a lot of people would second guess her simply because she's a woman. And that's really not okay.
Yeah. I completely 100% agree with you there. I think it's this wildly ridiculous idea that it just still permeates society. There's still things like legislation over a woman's uterus.
Yeah.
And things like that, where I just think, if that was a man...
Yeah, that's shocking to me. It's shocking to me.
Where is the legislation over a man's penis? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, it's not... There is no legislation.
Over his sperm, right? Over his scrotum. Where's the legislation over a man's...
What about all the sperm that the man takes to the place where they pay people for sperm, and say it gets chucked out, it just goes down the drain. Those are millions of cells that could be potential. I mean, I know it's kind of oversimplifying the idea, but my main beef when it comes to people who are anti-feminist or whatever is this idea. It's ludicrous that we should even be having this discussion of whether or not feminism should be or not be, because the fact is 50% of the world are women.
I think it's over 50%.
Yeah, I don't know the statistics exactly.
Why? Why not?
I know, because I'm a woman. I don't think about these things.
That's actually my main problem with feminism. My regular job is very much a male-dominated industry, and women are just getting into it. And sexism is a huge issue for me almost on a daily basis.
Yeah, I don't know how you put up with it, Madeleine. Well, I really don't.
It is significantly scaled back because of the kind of woman that I am and because I don't take any crap, but there is definitely a significant issue there. There's a pay issue. There's an issue of people focusing on what I wear versus how I act versus how I do my job, and no one would ever say or do these things to a man, and I think that that's why we really need feminism, but the fact that we need it is just really unbelievable.
I know. I mean, the fact that we even have debates, there are women, especially young women, who are like, oh, I'm not a feminist, that's gross. Is that burning bras?
God, I hate that phrase. No feminist has ever burned a bra. No woman who is paid through the nose for one would be so flagrantly wasteful. What happened was this. Carol Hanisch and the group New York Radical Women, protesting the Miss America pageant in 1968, had planned to burn numerous, quote, instruments of female torture, end quote, including a girdle, a mop, an issue of Playboy magazine, and, yes, a bra. But they were stopped by police before they could set fire to the rubbish bin into which they had tossed everything. The media picked up on the alliterative appeal of bra burning, and so was born yet another stupid verbal stick with which to beat feminists.
Does that mean you hate men? No. Caitlin Moran, who's a wonderful feminist comedian in the UK, would say, the test of if you're a feminist is if you stick your hand in your pants and you have a vagina and you want to have control over that vagina, then you are a feminist. The only thing wrong with that is that it doesn't include men who are feminists as well, because obviously there's lots of wonderful men who are great on feminism and who support and love women and support females' equal rights and things like that. I think it's just ignorance, because I don't know how anyone with a brain can be like, oh, I don't want rights. Rights? Phooey! You know what I mean? It's like, so you don't want equal pay and you don't want to be treated like just on a basic human level with respect. And
Yeah.
you know,
I know.
but that's fine.
It is total ignorance. I agree with you.
Anyway, today we're going to be talking about feminism, specifically with regards to sex working, because obviously the sugar baby thing can be seen as sex work. I think that we on this podcast are very sex positive.
Yes.
And so I think we should explain and unpack that a bit. What do you guys see as being sex positive?
Sex positive sex. We're done.
Ruby, you want to have a go? I'm talking about people who really won't understand what we mean when we say sex positive.
Yeah, well, I would say that sex positive means that you do not view sex as a dirty, shameful thing. You view it as a really wonderful, natural, healthy thing. And that sex is also something that we as a society should talk about, something that we should acknowledge, embrace, understand about ourselves, that we should teach our children about in a responsible way. That's what I'll go with.
I think that's an excellent summary. Can you just summarize everything in my life? Like when I have kids one day, can you come and explain to them about everything?
You know what? By the time you have kids, they'll be at such an age that I'll have already made all the mistakes on my own children. So I'll definitely be able to give you the play-by-play of what works in the sex talks and what doesn't.
Great.
And notice how that was plural, sex talks, because it is an ongoing conversation, whether it's with your children, with your spouse, with your friends, whomever. Like, sex positive means that you're talking about sex.
And unfortunately, it actually isn't that common even amongst my friends, I don't even know. Ruby, you and Madeline are probably the only people that I can really, obviously apart from my partner, who I can be really honest about it. I mean, people are sort of skeeved out about it.
Skeeved out?
Oh my God.
That's the term. That's the official term.
No,
for it.
I mean, I know what skeeved means, but
Maybe there's something wrong with us, Ruby.
Oh my gosh.
No, there's nothing wrong. This is the thing. I believe that there's nothing wrong with it, but I mean,
I'm just surprised to hear that, Esty. I'm really surprised to hear that because, I mean, obviously I know you really well. I love you to death. You're such an open person. You're so easy to talk to. You're really non-judgmental. And I've met a few of your other friends, but I don't know them that well. And I don't know, I'm just surprised. I would have thought that the circles that you travel in, especially considering how creative all of you are and how liberal in a lot of ways, I don't know, that's just really surprising to me.
I think it's just, it's not easy to segue into, so, what are you guys doing in your sex life?
Oh my gosh. Madeleine, do you need a segue?
No, absolutely not. But my question there is, though, is that a cultural issue?
It could be, yeah.
An appropriateness kind of thing, as opposed to us where we're sort of, hey, listen, this is what happened. I can't wait to tell you about it because, you got to try this.
Oh, yeah, I think you're right. I think it is probably, to an extent, a cultural thing. Having said that, a lot of people I know are having kids, etc. And you just mentioned sex, and it's like, I mean, I had one friend who's got a small baby, and she's breastfeeding, and she's like, I would be happy if I never had sex again. And I was just like, oh my God.
Aw, that poor woman. Listen, as the only person on this podcast who has had children, I'll tell you, your hormones go so crazy. I mean, you guys have a very good idea of how raging my libido typically is. I mean, let's be honest. I love sex. I want to have sex. Sexy time is happy time for Ruby. But, I definitely went through a long phase after each of my children, particularly my daughter. You do go through a long phase of not wanting sex. So hopefully that friend of yours will come around. I want to make sure that anyone listening out there doesn't feel like sugar babies are down on pregnancy or down on parenting or anything like that.
No, that's good. That's a good point. Okay, so let me get started with, I'll just give you the little précis. So they're saying, it's like if anything else was, any other dangerous job. If you wouldn't make, coal mining is dangerous. Let's make it more dangerous by criminalizing it or something. You wouldn't do that. You'd make it less dangerous by decriminalizing it.
And regulating it and providing resources for the people who work in that industry.
Exactly. Yeah. And support and all that kind of stuff. I mean, this seems to me to be really obvious and straightforward. And not only that, it's been carried out in a lot of different countries.
Mm-hmm.
Holland and Sweden and places like that.
Here ST is actually conflating two very different approaches. In the Netherlands, as well as Germany and New Zealand, indoor sex work is entirely decriminalized on both the supply and the consumption side. The situation in Sweden is quite different. I'll get to that. First, as I mentioned at the beginning of this episode, I don't oppose sex work. Unlike radical feminists, I don't believe the practice is inherently exploitative. But I do have very real concerns. The nature of the industry, whatever its legal status, is by necessity private and covert. And this makes it insanely easy for unscrupulous profiteers to exploit vulnerable people. Again, to quote Julie Bindel, she writes in The Guardian, "In Nevada, where brothels are legal, I interviewed a brothel owner who was pimping out a severely learning disabled young woman who had been sold to the brothel by her boyfriend's father. The fact that the brothel this young woman was being sold from was legally sanctioned and seen as a business, no different from a restaurant, meant that the pimp was able to present herself as doing her employee a favor by giving her a job." End quote. While my jury's still out on the legalization of prostitution, I incline toward the so-called Nordic Model, pioneered in Sweden in 1999 and spreading. It's now law also in Norway, Iceland, both Northern and the Republic of Ireland, Canada, France, and South Korea. Under the Nordic Model, the selling of sex is decriminalized while the buying of sex remains illegal, placing the burden of blame and the risk of accruing a criminal record squarely on the client. Sex workers participate in the economy, pay tax, and are protected by labor laws. Since the Nordic Model's inception in 1999, not a single prostitute has been murdered by a client or pimp in Sweden, although one was murdered by a former partner. I don't have statistics for the other Nordic Model countries, unfortunately, but meanwhile in Germany, New Zealand, and the Netherlands, where prostitution is wholly legal for both sellers and buyers, there's a significant death toll among sex workers. 55 sex workers were murdered by Johns over 13 years in Germany, and there were 29 attempted murders. In the Netherlands, whose population is less than a quarter the size of Germany's, 28 sex workers have been murdered by Johns over 15 years. In New Zealand, Ngatilanet Manning, Susie Sutherland, Anna Louise Wilson, and Nutira Sky Vaiku were brutally murdered by punters between 2005 and 2010. Only 4? Remember, New Zealand has a population just over 4.5 million, less than most major cities. For more information about the Nordic Model, you can visit nordicmodelnow.org.
Only wrote off freedom, won't be doing that again. Only wrote off freedom.
There are studies and statistics based on good research that suggest that it leads to the lowering of STDs and the lowering of people saying that they've been raped and things like that. Decreases in these areas.
That makes total sense to me.
Wrote my master's thesis on this topic.
Oh, wow! So you know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so
Exactly, yeah.
I feel like if your argument is that they are vulnerable in any case, you're making them more vulnerable by criminalizing what they're doing because they can't go to police, they can't seek protection, they can't seek support. And that just doesn't make sense to me. Even if you feel that they don't have a choice or they're in some way being coerced, isn't it better to at least allow them the support that would make it easier for them to perhaps leave that world if they wanted to, if it wasn't ideal for them, if they didn't enjoy it?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. You know, in the famous words of the wonderful, now deceased George Carlin, an American comedian extraordinaire, selling is legal and fucking is legal. So why isn't selling fucking legal? It's a moralistic argument at the crux of it, saying that any form of sex work should be criminalized is a moral argument. It is not a humanistic argument. I would go so far as to say it's not even a secular argument. You know, most of the people who rail against prostitution do so thumping their Bibles and, you know, waving shit like that around.
Very prominent prostitute in the Bible, by the way. Go on. Just saying.
Yeah, just saying. Yeah.
And Jesus loved her.
He did love her. Absolutely. He didn't think there was anything wrong with her. So, yeah, and to say that all sex work should be criminalized because women are coerced into it and so on and so forth. That's not the full picture. That's really cherry picking in order to try and support this moralistic argument.
With that in mind, let me give you the other side of the argument. So these are the feminists who are against. Their idea is basically that prostitution itself is inherently laced with sexism, classism, and other unbalanced power relations, which seems sort of like circular logic to me.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like
It absolutely is.
Yeah. Society is like this, and because society is like this, we can't do that. No, fucker, change society.
Exactly.
I would argue that the media is an industry that allows women to be seen as sex objects that can be used and abused by men.
Yeah,
What more
agreed.
prevalent area is there than that?
In terms of reinforcing stereotypical views, it's so deeply entrenched that I don't think that this is where it all comes from. Prostitution, that's where it comes from. The
Prostitution is where it ends. The media is where it begins.
So that's an interesting point, I think, because they're kind of likening it to slavery. They're kind of saying,
well, you have to remember, it's interesting that they say that because prostitution used to be called white slavery.
Well, in many parts of the world it is, literal slavery, and that is a completely different story if someone is kind of forced into it,
But that's also the argument for legalizing it, and I will field that. My opinion on this is that the entire industry where it's not legal exists in the dark. And so it's allowed to flourish in a detrimental manner. So no one is forced to be tested. So in Nevada, prostitutes, everyone has to be tested on a weekly basis. It keeps them safe. It keeps their customers safe. Transactions are handled before any physical business takes place, and the money is taken out of the room so that no one can beat up the prostitute and take the money back. It's a safer scenario that you have to obtain a license. So if I think the licensing procedure is, I wouldn't say that it's loose, but it's sort of send in a form and whatever. But if a licensing procedure were obtained in a one-on-one situation, trafficking would be a lot harder to do. You couldn't force somebody to walk into a room with a police officer and apply for a license without them being able to say, I don't want to do this. And that changes the entire trafficking game.
Of course, there'd be steps in the process where if they were abusing the people or it was against their will, they'd be able to be stopped.
Also, let's talk about the acceptance of sex work within society. So, one of the arguments, I suppose, against decriminalizing it is that there's such a stigma and, we don't want to encourage women to go into this type of industry, whatever, sex work. I'm the kind of person who says, screw that. Society's wrong on this. And we need to start changing the hearts and minds of people. And you don't do that by continuing to allow something to function in the dark. You need to bring it out to the light, allow people to understand what's going on, who's involved in this, and come to realize that there is nothing shameful with sex. There is nothing shameful in someone saying, hey, I really want this type of physical contact and intimacy, and another person saying, okay, I'll provide that to you, and in exchange, I would like XYZ.
Nobody feels bad asking to be paid for their services as a typist. Nobody feels bad asking to be paid for their services as a taxi driver. Nobody feels bad asking to be paid for their services as a football player. But for some reason, this has a stigma attached to it for, I'm particularly good in bed and I'd like to be paid for it if you want to have sex with me. And I'm not in love with you.
I mean, this is the thing. There's so many levels where I feel like it's how endemic slut shaming is and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
My main thing is I feel like your institution or your beliefs are only as strong as your ability to defend them. It's like when it comes to religious beliefs, if you are constantly going, I refuse to listen to anything that you say against my religion, if your belief or your faith is strong enough, you should be able to go, no, challenge me. I invite challenges because I know that my faith is strong enough to withstand them, and I can explain it to you, and you can talk to me, and maybe we can exchange ideas. I think that's healthy. So I think the exchange of ideas needs to be encouraged rather than stifled, and it's stifled as long as there's no decriminalization. because we can't talk about it. We shouldn't be talking about whether or not it should be decriminalized. We should be talking about, okay, so what's the process going to be like, and how can we make more women's lives across the world easier and and safer?
Well, and doesn't that come down to the whole point about how men and women are valued?
Well,
It's for the majority. I mean, of course, there are lots of male prostitutes. Typically, I think they're very young male, sex workers. But this is a woman's issue in large part, and women are not valued the same way in our society that men are. That's just how it is. If men were the majority of the sex workers, I really genuinely don't believe that we would have the same type of landscape to be discussing as we do right now.
The difference is that women don't need to pay for sex most of the time. The irony of what we were saying before about how most sex workers are poor and it's an act of desperation is this podcast. And the people who spoke those words have never actually seen these transactions go down and don't understand how much money there is to be made. Yeah. How much money men are willing to pay for this. And the problem, the women who take so little money for it, they don't know their value.
Yeah.
And they are desperate, so they take what they think they're worth and not what they actually are worth.
I am pure and I care for virtue, no. Wolves can claim this kind of value still. I sense their stare, a soiled glare from dance dangerously inviting.
Madeleine insists that the very existence of the Sugar Baby Confessionals podcast belies the claim that prostitutes are poor. The fact is, Madeleine and Ruby are outliers. The majority of women who engage in sex work do for reasons of poverty and/or coercion. Very few women enter the sex industry by choice, although there are examples. A friend of the late Laura Leaf joked that Lee had become a sex worker to throw off the stigma of having been a bank manager. The argument frequently made by campaigners for legalization of prostitution often runs along the syllogistic lines of, I would know if I was being exploited, and I'm not. But the experience of one independent sex worker with agency, control, and choice simply is not representative of the experiences of the thousands of vulnerable women who are trafficked, who work under the control of pimps, or who turn in desperation to the uncertainty and frequently violent area of sex work in order to feed themselves, their families, or their addictions.
Yeah, or usually a man, it's not always like that, but who is the John usually has the power. He's usually the one who sets the price. He's usually the one that skims off the top. He's usually the one, you know what I mean? So it's kind of, once again, she doesn't really have the control over her own body. Whereas if it was legal, perhaps less women would need to have a middleman arranging things for them and taking control of their body away from them.
It's that you make a good point, and I know that many women who are in prostitution, that's the situation they find themselves in. However, obviously Madeleine and I have had such a very different experience. I don't in any way feel like I am powerless in the situation. In fact, I feel like I'm in the pound seat. Yep. I feel like I've got the goods and the sugar daddy wants the goods, and I'm not going to give them up unless I'm happy with the situation. And, if he and I can't come to an arrangement that works for both of us, then I say, all right, sorry.
Yeah.
Good luck to you, and the next one will come along, and that's fine. Contrary to the idea that women are coerced and feel powerless, if anything, I would say this experience has been the exact opposite for me.
Ruby feels like she is the one with the power, as well she might. Ruby's involvement in the sugar baby lifestyle is as far removed from the experience of the average sex worker as a Silicon Valley programmer's is from the life of a child working her fingers to the bone at an apple factory in Guangdong. Ruby has a great deal of weird privilege on her side. That's WEIRD, a demographic acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. Ruby is white, educated, urban. She lives in a dual-income household and will be the first to point out that she doesn't need to rely on sugar babying to survive. This fortunate accident of birth, combined with her enviable self-assurance, sense of worth, and loving support system, give her a great deal of power. But once again, Ruby and Madeleine are the exception, not the rule. Above all, Ruby has the power to say no, which is not a luxury of which many sex workers can boast.
What an ego boost to meet a man who desires you so much that he's willing to fucking pay you for it. It's like,
And handsomely.
wow.
The other part of that is, and this goes way back, the first female American millionaires were madams. And I think that that's a very important portion of what we're talking about here.
Here Madeleine tells us that the first American women millionaires were madams. Now, even if this is true, it's irrelevant. Madams are pimps, not prostitutes. Feminism isn't about individual women reaching the high levels that men have by exploiting other women. It's about all women, particularly those in positions of power, working together for the betterment of all women. Feminism is a collective. We don't fling each other under the bus when it serves our individual interests. Which brings me back to my earlier point. Wives are women too. To have one set of rules for the sugar babies, we're liberated, we're cool, don't judge us, and another for the wives of their daddies. Oh, they're hopeless, how can she not like oral sex? Affairs can save a marriage. Smacks of elitism and, frankly, bullshit.
Having women be able to reach the high levels that men have, and how do we do that? But one of the main things that we have, the source of our power, the source of all life, you, Mother Teresa, the thing from which all things spring, the thing that men are most afraid of in the world, yet they seek it all the time, we're not allowed to use that.
Side note, as a feminist, I'd like to point out that Madeleine doesn't speak for all women when she alludes to female genitalia as the source of our power. In my case, my power derives from A, my undeniable white privilege, B, my beautiful singing voice, and C, my extraordinary brain. My organs of generation and the feats of which they are capable come pretty far down the list. Otherwise, I'd be a full-time fuck machine and baby-making factory, and I'm good for a lot more than that.
The source of our power, that's an interesting way of phrasing it, Madeleine. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I mean, let's go back to the media
It
conversation.
sounds like She-Ra, you know. Did you ever watch that when you were a kid? Like, there was He-Man and then there was She-Ra.
Normally, I'm not in the habit of apologizing for other people, but in this instance, I feel I must chime in. Our esteemed ST is referring to a truly terrible cartoon series from the 1980s, She-Ra, which was itself a spin-off of the massively popular and heavily merchandised He-Man. The titular characters were twins, Brother Adam and Sister Adora, who occupied the states of Castle Grayskull and the Crystal Castle, respectively. They both fought baddies, she as She-Ra and he as He-Man. Adora and Adam would transform into their superhero alter egos by holding aloft unnecessarily ornate swords and speaking their signature phrases. He-Man's was, "By the power of Grayskull, I have the power." She-Ra's was, "Pay attention now. For the honor of Grayskull, I am She-Ra." He has the power twice. What's she protecting? Honor, a word synonymous until practically yesterday with virginity. He-Man is Lord of the Manor, fighting by the power of Grayskull. She-Ra, just a servant. She fights for the honor not of her bling-bling crystal castle, but for her brother's monkey green ruin. Thanks, Hanna-Barbera. Nice role modeling there.
I think that is one of the profound problems that I have with it, and it's one of the things that people kind of step around and they sort of say, oh, well, you know, if you make it legal, then you're making it all right, and you can just have a prostitute living next door, and that would be gross, and, you know, all of this kind of stuff.
Well, I think a lot of people probably do, and they just don't know it. I mean, could you imagine going door to door in my, you know, pretty little suburban neighborhood on the ocean and, like, ask my neighbors, like, hey, Hey.
Here's
What
a
do you
cookie.
think of Ruby next door? Oh, she's such a nice mother. Such a good little homemaker.
I thought you were gonna say go door to door and with your like basket of cookies and be like, oh, and on the back is my phone number for sex work. If you know, if you and your husband need a bit of.
I should probably do that one day. If things online ever dry up, I'll just go door to door with a basket of cookies.
There's a great article by a guy called Herman Lopez, who writes for Vox. Dan Savage's brilliant podcast, Savage Lovecast, put me onto it. And it's called, I looked at the best evidence for banning prostitution. It's absolutely terrible. And basically he looked at all the data, the reliable data that's out there on being pro or against decriminalizing prostitution. And he found that most of the evidence that doesn't support it is not good. It's not well researched. Even the researchers themselves, he was saying, in many large studies, were kind of saying it's not really good. It's almost like they're looking for the confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And they're trying to kind of make the facts fit to that.
Herman Lopez's Vox article is indeed excellent, and it does constitute a pretty thorough review of the statistics and evidence available. But what Lopez doesn't mention, and it's worth pointing out, is that the feminist abolitionist movement, those like Julie Bindel and others, who oppose legalization in favor of ending prostitution altogether, is driven less by evidence and more by ideology. It's not that abolitionists are moralizing ninnies who support criminalization over legalization. They seek outright eradication of the sex industry. Their premise is that sex work, by its very nature, creates an unequal power dynamic between supplier and consumer. To put it very simply, if the customer, usually a man, is always right, the supplier, usually a woman, is placed in a disadvantageous position, with fewer rights than her counterpart. Abolitionists argue that where sexual activity is commodified, consent is non-existent. If you have to pay me for sex, then by definition I don't consent freely. Now, I'm not saying I agree with the abolitionist stance, but there's a very good reason their data is flawed by scarcity or confirmation bias. There exists no environment in which the absence of the sex trade can be studied. No such space exists. Prostitution is practiced, legally or illegally, or somewhere in between, in virtually every society the world over, and not only in human societies. Thus, academics and other stakeholders have access only to environments in which the practice is illegal, and hence fraught with danger for sex workers, which counts in favour of decriminalisation, or environments in which the practice is decriminalised or legalised, and hence on average somewhat safer for sex workers, which also counts in favour of decriminalisation.
You say you feel strange. No. You say you feel strange.
In analysing the data, therefore, abolitionists can resort only to conjecture as to what a world free of prostitution could look like. You see, they reject the status quo. Unlike a lot of people, they refuse to accept as a fact of life that there will always be men who want sex but can't get it, and women who, whether through choice, coercion, or want, will provide it. The movement envisions a world in which there is no demand for prostitution, and hence no supply. Everyone gets to freely fuck only whom they want to. Since this utopia is entirely theoretical, it's no wonder there is scant evidence in its favour. Lopez also points out that sex trafficking constitutes only a fraction of human trafficking. He quotes sociologist Ron Weitzer in saying it makes sense that there might be 9 times as much labour trafficking as sex trafficking, end quote. Which positively begs the question, isn't all human trafficking inhumane and egregious? Weitzer explains that multiple industries use trafficked human labour, citing domestic work, agricultural work, factory work, mining and shipping, none of which are illegal. Despite the visibility these trades' very legality should provide, people are still forced into these jobs. It's hard to see the argument in favour of legalised prostitution in this.
Whereas there's a lot of excellent research on how decriminalisation can lead to decreasing STDs, decreasing rape. You obviously hope they're not going to go out and rape anyway, but, you know.
Well, it's a reality, isn't it? Unfortunately, rape does exist in this world, so figuring out any kind of way that we can structure things to reduce it is nothing but a good thing.
And here Ruby unwittingly voices a sentiment feminists loathe. Rape exists, so let's accept that and place the burden of mitigation on potential victims rather than perpetrators. Boys will be boys, and some boys will commit rape. They just can't help it, poor lambs. So give a man a fish and he'll eat for a day. Give a man with a hard-on access to a legalized sex industry and, he won't rape that fish, I guess? More prostitutes equal less rape. So the answer must be more prostitutes. And for the rest of us, longer skirts, less makeup. Oh, and women not being allowed out in public unaccompanied, but only the good girls. You see where I'm going with this. I referred just now to the sex work abolitionist mindset as being utopian. Feminists of all stripes are similarly idealistic. We envision a world in which the burden of eradicating rape lies with the gender that perpetrates the vast, vast majority of sex crimes and not with their potential victims. What a fine world that would be. Why the fuck aren't we living in it already?
Yeah, something that I want to bring up is the idea that, Madeleine's comment about the source of our power and how everybody wants to control it but us. I was thinking to myself that in and of itself is such a powerful thing to say and to think about. And, it starts with women, doesn't it? And I was thinking how women aren't comfortable with their bodies. They're not comfortable with their vulvas and their vaginas and their wombs. They're not, so many women don't even know the proper names of their own anatomy. I was thinking about my grandmother who never once went to a gynecologist to be properly examined and have a checkup. Never. I asked her and she was completely offended by the question, as if I had asked something shameful, because just by the mere question, have you ever seen a gynecologist? I immediately implied that there would be someone looking at her hoo-hoo, as she calls it. Like she couldn't even call it the real name.
In fairness to Grandma, and I know we've discussed this before, I do not like the word vagina. I'm probably a bit funny about.
Are you guilty of this?
I do call it vagina, but I don't love,
Do you like the word cunt?
I don't love that word either, I have to say. I'm gonna have to come up with my own word that's not twee, but that's also not jarringly makes me think of like gubbins. It makes those horrible medical kind of diagrams.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing.
Do you feel the same way about the word penis? Do you feel like that's too?
No, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. But I mean, it's not a very sexy word either.
I'm with ST on the word vagina. It's not a pretty word. It's Latin for sword sheath, implying that its entire purpose is to have a sword or penis inserted into it, making even our most feminine attribute all about the men's. Feminists from Germaine Greer to Zoe Williams and beyond are keen to reclaim the word cunt, in much the way that African Americans have reclaimed the N-word. As Gillian Schutter writes in Ms. Magazine, it was originally a term used to revere the wisdom of women. In pre-agrarian days, cunts were tacitly celebrated as purveyors of pleasure and knowledge, end quote. But the word cunt has been so vilified for generations that reclaiming it is a big ask. I had a very lovely boyfriend who referred to my fnu. But adorable as it is, that's an infantilizing term for a very grown-up and sophisticated piece of equipment. I like the term employed by the authors of the Kama Sutra, yoni, the Sanskrit word for sacred space. That sounds more like it to me.
But there's like a discomfort in referring to female genitalia, and nobody feels that discomfort referring to male genitalia. Yeah. So anyone listening to this podcast, if you, in your own small way, you want to fight the good fight, get in touch with your own source of power. Get in touch with your own vagina, your own vulva, your own labia, your own clitoris, your own everything. Just cervix, fallopian tubes, learn it all.
Are you saying to own your goods?
Own your goods. Own it. Be comfortable with it. Love it. I think when women really start loving themselves, then they're going to demand for things to be different.
It's like, with Caitlin Moran, that's why I like the idea of it being a physical thing. She says, put your hand in your pants if you have a vagina. You know what I mean? Like, grab a hold of it by the short and curlies.
I'm going to make it really dirty for you. I kind of like Cookie a little because you can tell people Eat it.
Oh, dude.
I take your point. I was in the bathroom at my in-laws' house one day, and my daughter, who's very young and had just learned to use the potty, was sitting on her little kid toilet, and she was finished, and my mother-in-law said, "Okay, let's wipe your cookie." And I said, No, 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 no. You are not going to be teaching my daughter to refer to her beautiful body by those weird, silly names so that she feels some kind of disassociation
Yeah.
from her
Good
own
for you.
anatomy. No.
Good for you.
I was like, that's called a vulva. That's what we call it in our house. She can wipe her vulva. Thank you very much. And she didn't argue with me, but I could tell that she was very uncomfortable about it. And I can understand because she's uncomfortable with her own body. So, of
Yeah.
course, she's going to try to transfer that onto my daughter. And we just can't have that. Can't have it anymore.
No, I think it's true. I think with the next generation, the only thing we can do to sort of really fight this, what is an endemic worldwide way of thinking, is to just start with the fresh women, the women who haven't yet been
The ones who haven't been tainted.
Yeah, you know what I mean.
Untainted.
No, but in a way,
As
I mean,
opposed to us.
us old jaded old hags.
New name, the Jaded Old Hag Club.
Tainted centurions.
Yeah, it's the tainted. Wow, I love that, man. That's a novel waiting to happen.
It totally is.
Kicking ass and taking names in the name of feminism. Yeah, but you know that's what I mean. Because it's a learned thing. And
It is. Yeah.
It's about feeling ashamed merely because you're a woman, merely because you have a vagina. You know, that we should be fighting against. And the constant sexualization that they're bombarded with, that's what I worry about.
Well,
So
it's
many
two
images.
different messages at once
Yeah.
that are very confusing, right? It's the constant bombardment of sexual images and your body is not your own, you're just a sexual object. On top of, ooh, that's shameful. Sex is shameful.
Yeah.
You know, don't own your sexuality. We're going to legislate what, you know, society can do with your body, blah, blah, blah. It's like just all of it. All of it
With
is
the
just
ch-
wrong,
with-
wrong, wrong.
Yeah, this is the only way we can do it. Is these baby steps with the babies. Is try and wipe out that sense of shame that most of
And
us.
you know, and it's I mean, I think it's most important to concentrate on girls and young women, but we've got to be teaching our sons this stuff as well.
completely.
It's just as important to me that my daughter learn the proper anatomy for her body as it is for my son to learn it about his, and vice versa. So my older son, who can speak as opposed to the younger one who's still too small for it, he went through a roster of people he knows saying, "Daddy is a boy because he has a penis," and you know, Nana is a girl because she has a vulva, and you know, our nanny is a girl because she has a vulva, and mommy is a girl because she has a vulva, and grandpa's a boy because he has a penis. And I was like, that's right. Yes, very good. Very good. Yes, that's right.
Whoa, hold up there, Ruby. Campaigners for trans rights would challenge your cis-normative approach to teaching your kids about signifiers of gender. Not all women have vulvas. Not all men have penises. Hashtag not all men.
I can see that going down very well with your in-laws.
To that end, I think not only is it important to teach them to own themselves and to be respectful of each other, or to respect each other's bodies, but I also think that we have to teach young women to stand up for themselves. But I think with this incoming generation, I think it's important to impart feminism to young men,
100%.
because it's something that we've really fallen down with as a society. Even for those of us who believe in feminism, I think that we've left it up to women.
Well, I think that's where the main issue is that the people who are against feminism often use a polarizing factor by saying it's just a bunch of crazy-ass women who are burning their bras in the corner somewhere, and it's got nothing to do with real women or real men and their lives and how they interact with each other and the way the whole of society is structured. No. It's just a few crazy old bats with their cats. You know.
I only have one cat, thank you.
Yeah, we're on high cat alert here in Tainted Centurion Club to make
That's
sure.
right.
I mean, if you get one more, we're gonna go from like
Listen, I've had two.
green.
And it's
We're gonna
have
go
an
from green
intervention.
to orange. Yeah, no, two is still not like let's hit the red button, but yeah. Just
Three
be
is a
careful
problem.
there. Three's a crowd, okay?
That's right.
Don't worry, Madeline. If you die alone in your apartment, we won't let them eat you. Okay? We will not let the cat eat you.
Your
cry
cats won't eat your eyes. Don't worry. I won't let it happen. SD is right. We got your back. Your eyeballs will stay in your head.
You have to cut this out. I've explained this to Ruby before. My overwhelming fear in life is that I will die alone in this apartment and the cat will eat me. And then the other great fear is that she won't and she'll starve to death.
Oh, that's adorable. Oh my gosh, I can't believe that. You're like, but I don't want the cat to die. Feminism is about love, isn't it? It's about love, really.
Feminism is allowing that pussy to eat you. Okay?
Not just to eat the pussy, but for the pussy to eat you.
Exactly.
Economic vulnerability is what's at the heart of the whole sex working debate thing. Historically, women are responsible for children, responsible for old people, a lot more so than men in some stratas. Economics plays into this. You know, who's paying for what?
Well, that's an
Wow.
interesting comment. I mean, look at the way my life is structured. Obviously, from the outside, it looks like favorite person and I have an absolutely quintessential traditional nuclear family. We're married, we have 3 children, I stayed home and take care of them. He goes out of the home to an office and works and earns a paycheck. And that's the way in which our family is provided with financial means. However, I would not ever for 1 second think of myself as just a housewife. In fact, someone very close to me once phrased it like that, and I was so taken aback. It almost felt like I had cold water splashed in my face that she would think of me in this way, because I don't think of me in this way. She asked me the question, you know, what if your daughter one day, wanted to get married and she just wanted to be a housewife like you? Like, whoa, step off. That was a very sexist comment.
Yeah.
From someone who thinks of herself as an extremely liberal feminist person. But she looks at my life and she says, oh, because you're not out in the corporate world, you're not out in the outer world achieving something and earning your own paycheck, then, you know, how could what you do be of value?
Yeah.
So it's about choices, and it's about valuing those choices and being okay with them. So yes, on the surface of it, the life that I lead with favorite person is very traditional looking, but I would say that the manner in which I value my choices, the manner in which he values my choices and our choice, you know, as a family, makes us really untraditional. I mean, of course, the fact that I'm a sugar baby.
Well, there's
I was
that.
going to say there's one other
Yeah,
thing.
we have like an open marriage, you know, all that stuff aside, we're very traditional.
Yeah, I bet you were dying to just drop that bomb on her after she said that, just to say, really? Just a housewife? Wow! But, I mean, speaking of your daughter and uncomfortable questions that may be posed by and to her, we talked about this a bit in the family episode, but if we're talking about educating young women and inculcating them with a sense of not feeling shameful about sex and all that, how are you going to frame these experiences for her when she one day asks about it? She might not understand.
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. Right now, I would say that I don't feel any kind of need to share my sugar babying with my children. I mean, obviously they're all very, very young right now, so under no circumstances would that be appropriate at the moment. But even when they get older, I don't know. I think that that's a very private thing in the sense that it's kind of a sexual kink that my husband and I decided to walk the path down, or he allowed me to walk down this path of a fantasy I had. And I don't know. I don't know yet how open to the details I'm going to be with my children, because there is a certain line that you shouldn't cross in terms of what's appropriate to share with, you know, your kids and what isn't. I think I'll always be very open about the fact that I do not think sex work is shameful. So let me put it this way. If my daughter ever came to me and she was of an appropriate age, meaning that she was an adult and lived on her own and, whatever. She was certainly fully capable of making decisions about her life. And if she came to me and she said, Mom, I think I want to become a sugar baby, I would say, okay, sweetie pie, let me sit you down and talk to you about what's important. What are your boundaries? How are you going to go about this? How are you going to stay safe? That would be my response. Whether or not I ever admitted to her throughout the course of that conversation or others about her sugar babying, would I ever say, hey, I did this? I don't know. I'm fairly certain that favorite person wouldn't be comfortable with that. I don't know. It's difficult to say, but I certainly don't feel ashamed of it. I just don't think that it's appropriate to share with every single person. I mean, I don't want to sit down with my mother-in-law either and talk about my sugar babying, When it comes to something that we haven't discussed in this particular episode yet, and it's probably for another episode, but I'll just bring it up very quickly in order to answer your question as thoroughly as possible. How am I going to handle the polyamory aspect of my life? That's something I feel like I do want to share with my children because, if I have a relationship with a person and I'm in love with that person and I want to spend time with them and I view them as my family and I want them to be a part of my family. But it's such early days. I have no idea how that is going to happen, what it looks like, what I would say. We're really, really, really not close to that yet. Favorite person and I have so much more to work out first.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to throw it out there that
there's two different things,
yes,
isn't it?
Yeah. Exactly. There are two different things there. Exactly.
Obviously, Madeline and I, not having children, we don't really have to consider it yet, but it is something that I think about, how do you gift your child, your future offspring, your non-cat, your non-feline children with the idea that, sex is not shameful and there are these different permutations of relationships out there, and it's just people are different and they have different flavors to them, just like with any sort of tastes they might have. I think that's another aspect of sex positivity.
Yeah, that's a good point. Absolutely.
Because it feels like every time we cross one bridge, like we're becoming a little bit better with gay rights now. This gay marriage is becoming more widely legal and all that kind of thing, which is wonderful. And then now trans issues are coming to the forefront, and that's fantastic. But it still seems like there's a lot of sexual stuff, like polyamory and things that are kind of hidden, and people are, that's wrong, that's dirty, that's terrible, or whatever,
Baby steps for the babies. That's what
How do you feel about having kids? Are you into that idea?
I would so love for her to have at least one.
I cannot have children so that I won't die alone, and so you'll be happy.
You can, damn it.
Well, the marquee has been snipped, and there are no spares anywhere.
That can be undone.
That's true. And also, he has a giant head.
Listen, I know from first-hand experience that's no joke.
I thought you were going to say, as a first-hand experience of having a giant head, I actually do have an overly large head. And it is.
No, SD, it's your hair, man.
No, it's my head. I look closer in photos than everybody else. I always have to stay further away.
Closer. My perspective is off. But I think about raising children, and it's something that I struggle with, and my family. I think that my family, my parents in particular, struggle with is walking the talk. So we can sit here and say, Ruby was just, I think Ruby will be particularly good at this, actually, of being open to the conversation with her daughter, explaining to her boys about feminism, not being judgmental of people and their lifestyle choices. We can say that all we want to, and then we actually have to do it.
Yeah.
And I find my mother in particular has a tendency to be extraordinarily judgmental. So Ruby's like, oh yeah. And I hear myself doing that in my head, but I talk not being judgmental, and I have to remind myself that that's that person's life and it's not yours, and shut up. And so I think that we have to impart those things to our children, and then walk it as well. So don't tell them not to be judgmental, and then go ahead and say, oh my God, can you believe that they're doing that?
To that end, I mean, I wouldn't be particularly happy about the facts or the idea of, let's say, my daughter becoming a stripper in a really divey, cheap place, and like living in a shitty area, and like things were unsafe for her. Not because I think there's anything wrong with stripping, but because I wouldn't want her to be in that kind of a situation. So there's so much context around all of this that I think we need to keep in mind.
It's very nuanced. I mean, it's all right, as Madeline says, for us to be like, oh yeah, sex positivity, da da da. But if your daughter or someone came home and said, like, actually, I want to be a prostitute, you wouldn't be like thrilled about the idea.
Yay!
Certainly, you wouldn't be thrilled if it was still criminal. You know.
Yeah.
It's just.
Yeah.
I suppose it's just a case of trying to build a future where the choices they make, they can be safe within those choices and have access to the support they need. If that means you have to provide it yourself, you know, that's a different thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and for them to be happy, and you can sort of correlate sex work or prostitution to the drug debates. Like, you wouldn't be happy if your kid came home and said that they were going to be a drug dealer, but if they open up a medical marijuana dispensary in Colorado where it's totally legal and they make a lot of money, you're like, oh, okay, well, that sounds cool.
Yeah, there you go. That's a really great point.
Chill. And it sounds like it's going to make a lot of people really happy. Okay.
Yeah, exactly, and ease their pain in certain circumstances. Yeah, I know, which you could also relate back to the sugar baby thing. I mean. I think we've resolved all the world's issues when it comes to... if only the world leaders were listening to us now.
Well, hey, call on the tainted centurions and shit gets done, man.
That was the first half of our feminism segment, Tipsy Tarts. In the time since I began formulating my contribution to this podcast, Donald Trump signed into law the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act and Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, known rather clumsily as the FOSTA SESTA package. The purpose of these laws is ostensibly, as their names suggest, to curtail sex trafficking, which always sounds like a good thing, but there are already countless laws against sex trafficking. It's not as though there existed a gaping hole in the existing legislation through which women, men, and children were being trafficked under the noses of authorities powerless to stop it. A key component of the new legislation redefines the phrase participation in a venture to include, quote, knowingly assisting, facilitating, or supporting a violation of sex trafficking laws. And tellingly, it seems to consider all sex workers to be trafficked persons. This element of the laws makes the owners of websites liable for any content, including user-generated content, that could be crowbarred into the now exceedingly broad term, participation in a venture. The result has been that Craigslist has shut down its personal section, and other classified sites will no doubt follow suit. Craigslist has explained that the law will, quote, subject websites to criminal and civil liability when third parties, brackets, users, misuse online personals unlawfully, end quote. In other words, if any sex work is negotiated via Craigslist, Craigslist itself could be sued. And I should highlight that while Craigslist is the first major website to take preventative action, this isn't just about Craigslist. Other classified sites, porn sites, cam sites, escorting sites, hookup apps, and more can be liable to prosecution under FOSTA SESTA. For more on this topic, I highly recommend you listen to episode 598 of Savage Lovecast, where host Dan Savage speaks to sex worker and rights advocate Mistress Matisse about the far-reaching effects this legislation could have. It's not just that escorts and masseuses and sugar babies will lose the platforms on which they advertise their services. The knock-on effects of this legislation makes the already precarious lives of sex workers downright fucking perilous. Without these online forums, sex workers not only can't advertise, they can't screen potential clients, share warnings about known sexual predators, or just keep each other safe and supported. To tout for clients, they will have to turn back to the unsafe streets, and this increased visibility makes them vulnerable to arrest and/or abuse. For some, a slackening of reliable trade will force them to turn to pimps to act as their agents, further opening themselves up to violence and exploitation and substantially curtailing their earnings. As Molly Smith in The Guardian writes, quote, "Taking away our ability to advertise while ostensibly aimed at tackling exploitation often paradoxically pushes sex workers into exploitative relationships," end quote. As the former porn star, now activist and sex educator Conor Habib succinctly puts it, when sex workers don't have easy access to a variety of clients, it's harder for them to turn down or screen clients or to have in-community discussions about which clients are safe. This results, as is confirmed by Amnesty International, in violence against sex workers, end quote. And he's right. I've already talked about the dizzyingly high rate at which prostitutes are murdered by their johns in countries with legalized prostitution. But the murder and assault figures are no less damning in countries where the practice is outlawed. A peer-reviewed study of 854 sex workers in 9 countries found that 64% had been threatened with a weapon, 73% had been physically assaulted, and 57% had been raped. Of those 57%, more than half had been raped 6 or more separate times. The good news is that there has been considerable outcry, and for a change, it's not only from the seldom heard voices of sex workers and their allies. From free speech advocates and net neutrality groups who call FOSTA SESTA a disguised internet censorship bill, to every Craigslist user who relies on the personal ads for a naughty hookup or a long-term romantic partner. Even the US Department of Justice has voiced its concerns, pointing out that certain provisions of the bill will be self-defeating, making it even harder for authorities to prosecute sex traffickers. It may be that this large-scale opposition will galvanize some kind of movement against FOSTA SESTA, much as the metoo movement has refused to die away even though Harvey Weinstein made himself scarce. But I wouldn't hold my breath. Next week, we'll feature Lauren, an expert with a psychology background who'll be giving us her opinion on the long-term potential effects of sex work on the psyche. Also, the hosts of the Good Sex, Bad Sex podcast, journalist B.B. Lynch and sex activist and comedian Miranda Kane, will join ST for a light-hearted discussion of sex and pop culture. This episode was produced and edited by Sarah Mae Tucson, and researched, written and co-produced by me, Katherine Hofmeyr, with assistance from Beth Keane, Mike Scott and Geraldine Elliott. The music you've heard on this podcast comes from Danny Green's albums Obituaries and Leish, as well as Kristen McClement's album The Wild Grips. Find out more about Leish by going to lishmusic.com, that's Liash music.com, and hear Kristen's work at kristenmcclement.com. Do you also have some shit to say about this episode? Want to ask Ruby something? Depending on the response, we may create bonus content with Ruby answering the best listener-submitted questions. Email us on fablegazers@gmail.com. Tweet us at fable_gazers, or take a peek at our lovely Instagram account. That's at fablegazers, one word. Rating, reviewing and subscribing are very much appreciated and help to keep us going. Names and details have been changed to protect the anonymity of those involved. This has been a Fable Gazers production.